Hello, welcome back to Theater Journal Shorts. I'm here today with Dr. Rebecca Chaleff to discuss her recent article, Circumspect Moves, The Peripheries of Bebe Miller's Digital Archives, which is out in the June 2025 issue of Theater Journal. That's volume 77, number 2. Hello, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Really excited to dive in and talk about your upcoming article in Theater Journal. To start us off, could you give me a brief summary of the topic of your article and what your main argument is?
Yes, absolutely. So the main topic of the article are Bebe Miller's digital archives. Bebe Miller is a postmodern choreographer who is still working and creating work. And she has recently embarked on a series of archival projects that she has decided to make all web-based. So she has a series of projects that are all related to different works. She is interested in making the archive and the performance at the same time, which is something that distinguishes her archives from other artists. But then also recently, she has an archive about archives. So she got a whole bunch of artists together and scholars and curators to talk about archival practices in dance specifically. But my article is about the archives that support the creation of a work called In a Rhythm. Yeah, so there are kind of two parts to the argument that I'm making in the article, or at least the frameworks that I'm suggesting. So the first part is about a methodology that I have coined a circumspect methodology. The idea of circumspection, as I'll talk about hopefully a little bit later, comes from a workshop that I did with Miller. And so it's kind of a combination of a way of looking at art and also a way of within an artistic process. It has to do with directing your attention to the peripheries of a space, but specifically in a way that acknowledges partiality or the unwholeness of the subject. So that it's about ways of listening and seeing a work of art differently, and attending to what is outside or beside what would normally considered a central point of attention in a piece of choreography. So this approach leads us to considerations of things that are often considered peripheral to a work of art, specifically within processes and collaborators and their experiences. And it also just kind of emphasizes the vast networks of artists and their histories that come into the room during a creative process and then inform the creation of a work. I also think that an important part about this methodology is that it pushes against dominant structures of ownership that have become very prevalent in the dance world, specifically as choreographers plan for the futures of their works. So the second part of the argument is about the role of repetition and reproduction in charting futures for dance and choreography. I'm really interested in the ways that artists push against the what I consider an inevitable bind between performance and capital in order to create space for new social relations. And I see a lot of possibilities in what Miller is doing in her digital archives, because for her, repetition is a central mechanism of her project, but not necessarily through reproduction. It's used and made visible differently through the encounter, where you encounter um, the work of art again through different perspectives. So there's something about a repetition with difference there, but also through a circumspect methodology of never coming to the work as the same person, as the same subject. So looking at Miller's digital archives closely really helped me to think through some of the central assumptions of reperformance, repetition, and reproduction that have influenced our field for a long time.
Thank you. I think that's all really fascinating. And one of the things I'm particularly interested in is in this issue, we have a couple of different pieces that deal with this idea of process. And so combining a focus on process over product with these really interesting questions about ownership, repetition, coming to works over time all sounds really interesting. And I think really timely as we're, continuing to grapple with the way that digital afterlives of pieces we think of as live and ephemeral, et cetera, breaking down that binary is part of such big conversations in the fields of both theater and dance. Could you
Right.
tell us a little bit too about like how you came to this topic?
Yeah. So how did I come to to
Yeah.
this topic. So I came to this topic within the context of my book project. I'm working on a monograph called Choreographic Futures, Race, Sexuality, and the Politics of Reperformance. And in this book, I'm really grappling a lot with the questions that I've mentioned previously about the relationship between reperformance, reproduction, and repetition. And I'm specifically looking at it within the context of the ways that choreographers plan for the futures of their work. So this has been a major trend within the dance field for the last couple of decades, since the sort of quote unquote pioneers of American modern dance have, been passing and leaving their work often in really in a difficult situation for the people that are following them. There's been a really big emphasis on planning for the future of choreographic works beyond the lifetime of the artist. So this has led to a lot of interesting shifts in the dance world, particularly a new emphasis on copyright, on ownership, and exactly how to preserve and specifically to protect works of art. So there's a huge range in the ways that choreographers handle this. And the sort of first half of my book is spent critiquing contemporary artists that really go into the role of preservation and ownership and copyright, and then the second half is looking at artists who are reimagining even what the future of a choreographic work can look like or can be. And so that's how I came to Miller, is because I really think that she's asking really interesting questions about how a work of art survives. I mean, as you mentioned, there's so much of an emphasis on process. What I think is really interesting about her archives is that she doesn't include full performances. They exist elsewhere in the internet universe, but not within her archives, because her archives are focused more on the documentation of process than on the production itself. So it's really about the work living on through the process and the documentation of the process and the ways that people can encounter the process differently. And so I think that that's just a really interesting way of looking at how a piece of art can continue to live past its live moment of performance or past the lifetime of a choreographer. So that's how I came to the topic. And so I started looking into Miller's digital archives and watching more and more of her work. And eventually asked her for some interviews, and I did a workshop with her in the during the COVID pandemic. It was all virtual. So I was on Zoom in my living room working with people around the country. And it was just a really, really informative experience to be in process with Miller. And it really, really informed the way that I was approaching not only her and her artwork, but also her archives. I found that I had to really change my perspective, because there's so much in her work that's really not about even coming to the process as a whole person, about being open to others and letting others in, and also just understanding the like kind of lives and continuities that exist even outside of the present moment of embodiment. And it just really changed the way that I was looking at her archives and looking at her work. And it actually asked that I reframe a lot of the questions that I was asking originally. So that's why so much of the article is also about the methodology.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think it's really helpful as researchers and scholars for us to find ways in our work to be really transparent about the processes by which we came to the objects and subjects of our research, because I feel like that's another thing that gets obscured a lot in the final written version of things. You've already touched on this a little bit, but could you tell us a little bit more about the broader concerns of your research, or maybe other projects that this connects to, or maybe how you see both the book project and this article responding to conversations in the field?
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I would say most broadly that my work is looking at this kind of nexus of the relationship between liveness and presence, and performance, and time, in relationship to property and ownership. reperformance and reenactment have, for a long time in our field, been heralded as radical modes of destabilizing the relationship between performance and capital. And there are a lot of things that I appreciate about these studies and these works, particularly their reconsiderations of time and, looking at performance through alternative modes of time, or I would say not Euro-American or conventional forms of time. But I also, the more that I've thought about this, I've also begun to, kind of question a lot about it. And I do think that reperformance and reenactment still emphasize liveness and presence in a way that demands the kind of constant reproduction of performance. So doesn't that kind of ultimately feed back into a drive of the economy to constantly continue to production and to always generate something new? So it's been a really rich question for me to consider because, of course, reperformance is also a really valuable tool, especially in terms of preservation and the opportunities to reimagine choreographic works through reconstructions and reenactments. So they're not always just about making things as close to the original as possible. Reenactments are about reimagining, reconsidering, putting things in a different time and a different place, and being responsive to the moment. So I'm trying to really hold these two perspectives together as I think about different methods for creating futures for dance that extend the life of choreography within systems of capitalism that they both challenge and perpetuate.
That's fascinating. It's also making me think of the sort of corollary in Broadway and big theater shows where you have the rotating cast of famous figures playing the same roles in a show that's been set a long time ago. So it seems like while you're very solidly in the world of dance, what you're working on has a lot of implications for other areas of study in theater and performance.
Yeah, and one of the reasons that I'm focusing on dance is because I find that there's this kind of um, especially in modern and postmodern dance, there's this kind of mythical belief that it exists outside of the systems in which it
Mm,
operates. So when we look at Broadway, when we look at large commercial works, we call them commercial works because we understand
yes.
that they're there to be recreated, they're there to run, they're there to make money, they're there for the investors, that they generate income, that they generate
Mhm.
capital, that they're very clearly a part of this system. And yet there's this idea that modern and postmodern dance exist in kind of a different sphere and a different orbit. And in many ways they do. But I also think that it's important to consider the similarities too, like how do these modes of perpetuation happen, especially as we're thinking less and less about the performance of the moment and more about how do we extend the life of a choreographic work.
That's all fascinating. And yeah, can you even escape the capitalist superstructure? Maybe not entirely, while
At
still
least
pushing
within the
against it.
Euro-American context. Yeah.
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 So specifically, my last question is for any undergraduates or students who might be watching this as part of a class assignment or maybe alongside your article. What would you say succinctly are the key takeaways, or maybe, what do you want readers to think about how this reflects more broadly on contemporary US dance, theater, performance? We've touched on that a little bit, but specifically for those who might be coming to these ideas and maybe Bebe Miller for the very first time, what would you say are some of the key takeaways of your piece?
Yeah, I mean, I think for undergraduates, the article offers some really useful tools for how we look at and talk about performance, particularly in terms of what is and is not visible within the actual production, and how research can amplify our understandings, not just of the performance of self, but of its place in a larger network of artistic praxis. I think the approach of a circumspect methodology could really help some undergraduate students circumvent what I have witnessed as a common impulse to judge and evaluate work before considering its full breadth and meaning. So for more advanced undergraduates, I also think that this is an article that offers possibilities for thinking about live performance and the digital together in a way that is particularly prescient today, given the broad circulation of performance on digital platforms. I've noticed in my own classes that the circulation of dances on TikTok and social media is just the constant reference point.
Mhm.
So to think about it, in with a little more criticality in terms of, understanding that yes, the internet is this place for broad circulation. It's imagined as this utopic space of accessibility, but also what are its flaws, and what are the limits that it's constantly encountering, particularly in terms of representations of dance.
Absolutely, yes. Good to never forget that the internet is also motivated by capitalistic
No, that's,
intent.
yeah. I mean, now it's impossible to ignore,
Yeah.
with all of the crossover between tech and the Trump administration.
Yes, absolutely. But I love the idea of using the archives as a way to bridge to things that are coming up in conversation in classes and also are a part of a lived experience for many people today, right? A lot of us go to TikTok to see videos of choreography or even just sort of more extemporaneous dance. So I think I love that as a tie-in, and I think it hopefully will be very encouraging to all of our viewers to go ahead and check out your article. So again, for everyone who's watching, I'm here today with Dr. Rebecca Chaleff and her article, Dance's Peripheries, Moving Around Bebe Miller's Digital Archives, appears in the June 2025 issue of Theater Journal. That's volume 77, number 2. Thank you so much for joining me today. It was a real pleasure.
Thanks so much, Taryn. I really enjoyed talking with you today.